Hey, what's up everybody? It is me, Faith, Feifei, or Faye, whichever you prefer to call me, and this is my mess of a room, and oh my god, I have not uploaded a video in a very long ass time, so finally we're back with a video. This is a true crime video, and it's probably a case you unfortunately have probably heard of. The West Memphis 3 may be one of the most famous cases in Hollywood, and I'm fairly certain many of you watching have heard of this case. There have been numerous documentaries, movies, books written about this specific case because it is just so odd and strange, but also has a huge injustice that a lot of people perceive to have happened behind this case. This resulted in the fight against the demonization of individuals who dressed in darker clothing, had tattoos, and liked music that was considered to be satanic. The movement had come around and even shows some relevance in today's society, showing that a person's personal likings of a certain genre or clothing does not equate to them being a criminal or a murderer. But at the end of the day, 3 young children were murdered, and our attention needs to be focused on who did such a heinous crime and to bring the families closure and justice for their children. Anyways, let's get into the video. One of the boys was known as Stevie Edward Branch. He was an honor student, lived with his mother, Pamela Hobbs, his stepfather, Terry Hobbs, and his 4-year-old sister, Amanda. Christopher Byers was another boy who was described by his mother to just kind of be your average 8-year-old. He believed in Santa, he believed in the Easter Bunny, and was generally just a very nice and sweet young boy. He lived with his mother, and I believe from what I was reading, his mother and father had unfortunately divorced when he was very young. And finally, there was Michael Moore. He was a very enthusiastic boy who was considered kind of to be the leader of the group. He would wear his Boy Scout uniform to school even when there wasn't any meetings. He was very proud of the fact that he had gotten so far in his club, and he lived with his 2 parents and his older sister. The 3 boys were considered to be best friends and would play after school together and would do all these things together. They were all in the Boy Scout Club together in West Memphis, Arkansas, and had even all been 2nd graders at the same elementary school of Weaver Elementary. Unfortunately, on a day that seemed like any other, the boys would go play in an area that they were fairly familiar with called Robin Hood Hills, but would not return home alive. On May 5th of 1993, the 3 8-year-old boys had been reported missing by Byers' adoptive father, John Byers, around 7 p.m. after they had last been reportedly seen by a neighbor around 6:30 p.m. altogether, being called home by Terry Hobbs. This hit the community incredibly hard because not only was this a very small Christian community in the Bible Belt, but it also was a fairly secure and safe area in West Memphis, so this was just seen as unlikely to ever happen, or hopefully that the boys would be returning home just after being lost or something, but that wasn't the case. There was a search done that night, but no one had found any sign of the boys. It was only around 8 a.m. on May 6th that a more thorough police search began with the Crittenden County Search and Rescue personnel. They were canvassing the whole West Memphis area, but had focused mostly around the Robin Hood Hills area, considering that this was where the boys had last been known to be located. But despite the efforts of the group to do things like shoulder-to-shoulder searching, creating a human chain around the area, there was no sign of the missing boys. That is until 1:45 p.m. the same day. This is when a parole officer named Steve Jones had spotted one of the boys' shoes floating in a muddy creek that had been attached to a major drainage canal in the Robin Hood Hills area. Shortly after this discovery, the bodies of the boys had been found naked and hogtied with their own shoelaces. Their clothing had been found in the creek, and most of them were turned inside out. 2 of the boys' underwear had actually never been recovered and still have not been seen to this day. On the body of Christopher Byers, there had been several lacerations that were found all over his body, and this is a little graphic, but his genital regions had been mutilated. The initial suspicion, unfortunately, was that the boys had been sexually abused and assaulted due to the state that they had been found in, and there was even trace amounts of sperm DNA that were found on one of the pairs of pants belonging to one of the boys. Now, it was believed that the mutilation done to Byers' genital region was done by the murderers intentionally to destroy them, but there is a possibility that this was actually caused by snapping turtles that were around in the area who just were kind of snapping at the body, not knowing that this was a human body, because the bite marks the markings do kind of line up with the bite marks of a snapping turtle. From my memory, Byers was declared deceased due to the fact that he had so many lacerations on his body and he was basically stabbed to death, while the other two boys were considered deceased due to the fact that not only did they have these injuries, but also drowning. This is actually a clip of one of the mother's reactions after finding out the news about her deceased son.
From the moment they told me Stephen was dead, I really lost all touch of reality.
The boys were all laid to rest in different cemeteries after the discovery was made. Stevie Branch was laid to rest in Mount Zion Cemetery in Steele, Missouri, while Christopher Byers was laid to rest in Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, and Michael Moore was laid to rest in Crittenden Memorial Park Cemetery in Marion, I think that's how you say it, pardon me if I'm saying it wrong, Marion, Arkansas. The Robin Hood Hills had previous rumors of satanic rituals having taken place in the area, and so that's when the gossip began that the murders were a result of such rituals. In result, 3 boys were pointed at: Jesse Kelly, who was 17 years old at the time, Jason Baldwin, who was 16, and Damian Eccles, who was 18. Damian and Jason were both previously arrested for things like vandalism and shoplifting, and Jesse had a history with temper issues. Jesse and Damian had actually both dropped out of school, but Jason had very high grades and even had a talent for sketching and drawing that was encouraged by some of his teachers. Jason and Damian had been friends who were acquainted with Jesse, but they weren't terribly close to him. Like, they wouldn't consider him a friend, but they were friendly acquaintances. Damian was actually from a family who was in poverty and had visits from social workers constantly. This had resulted in the fact that he had a lack of interest in school and lack of attendance in school. He and his girlfriend at one point run off during a rainstorm and broke into a trailer, and this led to Damian's arrest of breaking and entering, or burglary, or whatever you want to call it. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he did get arrested. His girlfriend was let go, though. Now, Damian was originally suspected due to the fact that his girlfriend's aunt had called the West Memphis Police Department and claimed that she had seen him around the scene of the crime covered in mud. It was found out that Damian also had suffered very severe mental health issues, so severe that he actually had to apply for disability. The West Memphis Police Department officers who had performed the interview with Damian had asked things like what he thought the killer was feeling while he committed the crime. Damian replied saying that he thought that the killer had felt happy with the murders and was getting off on the thrill of being in power, and that they probably picked 3 young boys because young boys are naive and they're young kids, they're very trustworthy, and so it was easier to lure them into a false sense of security. However, this doesn't necessarily mean, in my opinion, that Damian is guilty of the murders. There's lots of people who are into how the mind of a killer works, and Damian was one of these people. Unfortunately, the prosecution just had absolutely brought all these things up in a way to demonize Damian. They even brought up at one point that he liked Stephen King books, which must have meant that he was into darker things, which would then lead him to being a murderer. But the thing that really screwed these teens over was the confession given by Miss Kelly, who had a very incredibly low IQ and claimed that he had been coerced into a confession by the police, constantly pressuring and suggesting ways that the children were murdered, as well as confessing that the 2 other teens were involved in the murders. This led to multiple confessions given by Jesse, but they all had changed by each confession that he gave of the story. But one of the things that has always struck people as odd is Jesse had a pretty solid alibi for the night that the boys were murdered. He was seen by multiple very trustworthy witnesses at some sort of sporting event. I can't necessarily remember what it was, but he was seen nowhere near the crime scene during the time that the boys were last seen, or even the next morning that they were found. On August 4th of 1993, all the boys had pled not guilty to the murders. But one of the things that also incriminated them is a fellow inmate of one of the teens had claimed that he had confessed to him about how they murdered the boys, but it was later recanted because the inmate claimed that his drug abuse had put him in a very poor state of mind, and at the time he felt like what he was saying was really what happened, but now that he's sobered up, he doesn't remember anything like that. But no matter the countering evidence to show that there was no way the boys could have done this, or even the claims of police coercion, the boys were all convicted and sentenced for the murders of the 8-year-old boys. Damien was sentenced to death by lethal injection, while Jason and Jesse were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, as I mentioned, this case became a very popular case, with just so many different types of media being created about this case, as well as marches and celebrities speaking out about how these teens were locked up for almost no reason other than how they dressed and how they appeared. Now, all these people believe that these teens were not guilty, or at least were not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They couldn't have been. There was not enough evidence to point that these teens had killed the 3 younger boys. The case had been decided to go through a retrial, and all the teens who were now adult men decided to take an Alfred plea. This means that they basically pled guilty to the crime while maintaining their innocence. This basically means that you can say, yeah, there's enough evidence against me to say that I did this crime, but I'm going to say I didn't, but I also don't want to go through a trial because I know I could be sentenced for a worse sentencing. Now, their sentences at this trial had been, I can't remember exactly how many years, but they basically had said, well, you've served most of those years in prison already, so we're gonna just let you go. And so they were released from prison and are actually now out in society. But if these 3 didn't commit the crime, that means the question is, who did? Well, there are also other suspects on the list that we haven't gone over yet. One of them being the stepfather of Stevie Branch, Terry Hobbs. Terry Hobbs was the last person seen with the boys. His DNA had also been found in the form of a hair on one of the boys' shoelaces, and had been accused of being abusive to not only Stevie, but his sister Amanda. Stevie claimed that he hated his stepfather, and his sister to this day believes that Terry abused her so badly that she can't remember most of her childhood and has it mostly repressed. She also claims that this is a reason for her very chronic drug problem. It's actually very severe how deep she's gotten into drugs because of the abuse she thinks she suffered due to Terry Hobbs. Terry also does have a history with violence, so far that there's a report of when he had broken into a woman's house and groped her after finding her in the bathtub. There are another 2 suspects known as Chris Morgan and Brian Halden, 2 teens from West Memphis who had previous drug offenses on their record and had left only 4 days after the bodies were discovered. This is where they would stay in California actually during the duration of the trial. It was assumed that Morgan had a weak connection to the boys because he had driven an ice cream truck and one of his routes was in the area where the boys lived. Both Halden and Morgan had taken polygraphs to show their innocence, but examiners, re-looking at it, showed that there were signs of deceit when it came to being asked about their involvement in the murders of the boys. Morgan also claimed that his drug problem was so severe that he would suffer blackouts and had major lapses in his memory. This is when he said that he might have killed the boys, but he quickly recanted and took the statement right back. The California police had actually sent blood and urine samples from the two to the West Memphis PD to investigate the teens, but this was simply not done, as they had already found their suspects and were determined to find out if the 3 that were convicted were the ones who did it, so it was kind of brushed under the rug. And finally, the last suspect is simply known as Mr. Bojangles, who was a man who had briefly been seen in a Bojangles restaurant near the Robin Hood Hills area. The man was identified to be as a mentally disoriented African-American male who had been bleeding and was brushing up against the bathroom walls, just kind of acting strange. Officers had conducted research on the restaurant a day after the bodies were found, thinking that this Mr. Bojangles might be a possible suspect. It was also confirmed that there was a hair that belonged to an African-American male found around the crime scene. But of course, they don't have an ID on this guy. All they know is that there was some strange dude walking around bleeding and just seemed disoriented. Other than that, there is no solid evidence on who Mr. Bojangles really is. Though we may never have a firm answer on who took these boys' lives, we do know that there was nowhere near enough evidence to convict the 3 teen boys who lost close to over 2 decades of their lives based on the conviction of assumptions and no hard proof evidence or even any DNA evidence. There's no evidence necessarily linking them to the crime, other than Jason and Damien didn't have very solid alibis, but Jesse did. This is why this case has just become so huge, because ultimately it wasn't only the loss of the lives of the 3 8-year-old boys, but also the loss of a majority of the lives of the 3 young adult men who were fresh out of high school for the most part. Having their names completely publicized with a simple Google search showing that they are known as the West Memphis 3 who committed a heinous crime against 3 young boys. And this will always follow them in their lives. But in the end, people lost their lives. People had lost their abilities to live a life that they once possibly wanted for themselves, and futures torn from the desire to find someone who they thought did a heinous crime of murdering 3 innocent boys. But at the end of the day, there's not much we can do about this fact. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Like I said, it was a very long thing to do. It took me several hours of research and writing a script just to get that short summary. There's so much more that I couldn't mention. I think if you're interested in learning more about this case, there are documentaries, and one of the ones I've heard has been thrown around a lot is called Paradise Lost. I have not seen it yet. I plan on seeing it. I was mostly reading articles and stuff, but I plan on seeing that documentary sooner or later. But I think if you want to learn more about the case, go watch that. I will say, Kendall Ray brought this up too. It is not necessarily a completely unbiased documentary, but it does give some information that I think you guys will think is interesting. Now's the part of the video where I casually shill my own TeeSpring. If you don't know, once a month I do a charity fundraiser on TeeSpring. I have always offered around this point 4 designs for the charity fundraiser. 100% of the profits will be going to a charity of my choice during that month. For the month of June, I actually had to do 2 because for some reason during May, TeeSpring wouldn't allow me to use the words mental health in the title or in the description, so I wasn't able to upload them under the idea of, oh, this is for mental health awareness, but I did upload them for June also. So there is 2 charities going on for the rest of, well, June's already over, it's now July, but till July 6th, 100% of the profits will either be going to the suicide prevention or to the Trevor's Project. It depends on which design you get. It'll say on the designs which one will be going to which. And then the chibi sticker, there will be 25% going to the suicide prevention, that's what I meant to say, and another 25% will be going to the Trevor's Project. If you're interested in any of those, the link will be in the description. Please consider checking it out. It always means a lot when I see that people are actually making an effort to help change the world in some way or another. And of course, if you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you have any thoughts, like who do you think committed this, again, very upsetting crime? If you think it was the 3 men who did it or who were convicted, please tell me in the comments. You know, tell me all your thoughts, like who do you think did it and stuff like that. In the comments, leave it all there. And if you like my content, like my true crime or my reviews, or even the more experimental stuff I've been doing, like my video on my depression or my video on my middle school experience, if you like content like that, go ahead and subscribe. It would make my day. And as always, let's try and make the world just a little less shittier. I'll see you all next time.